All right, so their talk today is applying the Society for Ecological Restoration's Ecological Recovery Wheel, or the SER Recovery Wheel, to the Middle Rio Grande. Zoë Rossman is one of the assistant science coordinators for the collaborative program. Her background is in urban ecology. She has a master's degree in biology from the University of New Mexico, where she researched urban mammal communities in and around Albuquerque. She brings her experience in local ecology to the program support team, where she is engaged in efforts to provide restoration, assessment, and monitoring resources to the program. And folks, please also put in the chat your affiliation and name so that we can keep a record. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Debbie, and thanks everybody for showing up. So as Debbie mentioned, the seminar is to introduce you to the Society for Ecological Restoration's Ecological Recovery Wheel, and explain why it's relevant and useful to the collaborative program, and then outline how it can be applied to the MRG. So first, I want to do some light audience participation and ask you a few questions. So if you could please just raise your hand on Zoom if any of the following apply to you. So first off, how many of you here today are restoration practitioners in any capacity? All right, cool, quite a few. All right, so how many of you then have a difficult time getting dedicated funding for long-term monitoring for your restoration projects? A lot of you. And some laughs. So how many of you have a difficult time deciding when to intervene and provide maintenance at a site and figuring out those thresholds? A couple. And finally, for how many of you would it be useful to have a powerful way to visually demonstrate restoration progress at your sites? Okay, again, quite a few of you. So these are common problems for restoration practitioners everywhere, not just in the MRG, and they really illustrate the need for scientifically vetted tools to justify long-term monitoring and demonstrate restoration progress. And that's what I'm hoping to show you today with this ecological recovery wheel. So a little bit of background here. At the August 2021 Habitat Restoration Workshop, participants voiced a need for a better approach to define restoration success at the habitat level. However, after learning about the SER's Ecological Recovery Wheel, the Science and Adaptive Management Committee made the decision that this wheel is an appropriate and useful tool to assess restoration success at the ecosystem level in the Middle Rio Grande. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to explain how the use of this tool at the ecosystem level can actually be directly tied to species-specific habitat restoration that many of you all do. So the recovery wheel is a part of international ecological restoration standards that have been vetted by the restoration community and applied to a wide variety of restoration work around the world. And I'm going to walk you through sort of the structure of the wheel here for those of you who aren't familiar. So the wheel is based on 6 key attributes, and these attributes together can be used to define an ecosystem. And these are species composition, structural diversity, ecosystem function, external exchanges, absence of threats, and physical conditions. Now, these attributes are based in the SER's restoration standards, and as such, they can apply to any ecosystem at a broad scale. Next up are sub-attributes. So these are represented by smaller wedges, which are components of the broad attribute and can be quantified using measurable indicators. And this is important. We'll come back and talk a lot about this later. Now, the attributes I'm showing you here are generic, but they can and should be customized to a particular ecosystem to be useful in that ecosystem. Now, since the attributes are measurable, we can use metrics to assign levels, or stars is the terminology that they use, where 1 star represents the most degraded condition of that sub-attribute, and then 5 stars represents full recovery. So how do we use this tool to demonstrate recovery? Well, sites are assessed pre and post restoration, and progress towards recovery is documented on the wheel. So here's an example of just a generic wheel from the SER standards with a baseline condition pre-restoration represented in green. So you can see that some of the sub-attributes are measuring fairly well, and some have sort of lower levels of recovery indicated by less green for that sub-attribute. And here's the same hypothetical wheel 10 years post-treatment, showing an improvement in most of the sub-attributes, so more green. You can kind of clearly see that the wheel on the right is better than the wheel on the left. Now, what's really neat about the SER standards is that they tie in with a lot of the current activities and goals of the collaborative program. So this tool isn't just coming out of left field. There's actually a lot of interrelatedness between the standards and the program mission and goals and objectives. So the standards require adaptive management. They're really based around adaptive management to get to a point of successful restoration. They engage a variety of interested parties. They list extinction risk reduction and single species recovery programs as priority areas. So we're great on that point. They require and rely heavily on expert opinions, as well as tying in with climate futures planning and habitat level restoration. So it really integrates very well with a lot of what the collaborative program is already working on. But the standards also provide an opportunity to strengthen restoration efforts within the program. So they actively incorporate an ecosystem approach, which is something that the program has just decided to incorporate, even though we're really already doing a lot of that already. These standards also provide a tool for long-term monitoring to evaluate restoration progress. They provide guidance for ongoing maintenance to prevent site regression, and they can provide guidance for considering social goals during restoration. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to use these standards and use this recovery wheel to really strengthen our restoration efforts. So since this may be a new tool to some of you, I wanted to walk you through a case study that shares some key characteristics with a lot of the restoration work done in the MRG. So this is a site called Flat Lick Stream in Fairfax County, Virginia. And here's just some nice photos that they had of their site pre and 3 years post restoration, which I guess is a little bit of a spoiler, but I don't think that really matters. And so the next few slides, all the graphics and information is coming from this case study. So the impetus for using the wheel here is that restoration practitioners trying to restore Flat Lick Stream wanted a tool to help evaluate systems, establish goals, direct design, and communicate the effect of the restorative actions. And they wanted this tool to meet a couple of key criteria, specifically to be simple, visual, adaptable, and science-based. And they decided that the SER recovery wheel met all of these criteria. So the goal of the restoration effort at Flat Lick Stream is to restore the structure and function of the stream by reconnecting the stream to the floodplain, reducing erosion, and planting native vegetation to provide food and habitat for wildlife. So a lot of commonalities with a lot of the restoration work done here in the MRG. And one important point is that ecosystem level restoration can be site specific. So this effort is to restore ecosystem function at a specific site, in this case, a portion of Flat Lick Stream. So they customized the SER wheel to this system to compare pre and post restoration conditions and to hopefully demonstrate the progress towards recovery, although I guess I spoiled that a little bit. Now, one thing that they talk about really well, and it's really important to consider when we're talking about the recovery wheel, is that it's not just a one and done at, the end of the first round of restoration efforts of a project. So the recovery wheel is applied throughout a project to inform planning and monitoring, and then to help evaluate success. So the wheel initially is used to identify areas for improvement at the beginning of a project, which can help practitioners decide where to focus their efforts and how to set restoration goals. And then using the wheel for long-term monitoring can help illustrate the trajectory of recovery at a site, but can also provide information to help managers decide when to intervene at the site, which is really key. So here I have the generic template wheel from the SER standards on the left, and then the wheel customized to flat lick stream on the right. And this is the pre-restoration condition. And I just want to talk a little bit about the differences between these wheels. So ideally, the attributes or the outermost ring shouldn't be altered in order to keep the wheel based in the core principles for ecological restoration. However, for this wheel, they've slightly altered the attributes. So I just wanted to point that out. But what's really important, and what I would like you all to focus on, and what's key to making the wheel relevant to a particular site or system, is customizing the sub-attributes. So you can see, and those are those smaller wedges. So you can see here, they have some very specific sub-attributes that address structure and function that they were looking to maintain or improve, such as floodplain connectivity, vegetated banks, and sediment transport. So again, those are all things that are very relevant to the work done here in the MRG, and why I think this is a particularly useful example. So how is the wheel actually used to illustrate progress for an actual restoration site? So this first wheel here is the pre-restoration condition. So the blue is the measured condition of the site pre-restoration for each individual sub-attribute, and the yellow is the restoration goals or the design specification. So the desired levels that they were trying to achieve for those sub-attributes through their restoration effort. And the second wheel on the right represents the site condition 3 years post-restoration. So the green on the right is the post-restoration measured condition overlaid on top of the blue, which is the pre-restoration condition, and then the yellow, which is the design specification. So as you can see, for many of the sub-attributes, there was an improvement for most of the metrics after 3 years. So they do note that some metrics are slower to respond, and so they could expect to see an increase in certain areas when they monitor the site 10 years post-restoration as opposed to 3 years post-restoration, and those would be things like tree canopy. So this is something that, again, it's used over the life of the project. It's really useful in demonstrating continual progress or site regression, and can be used for many, many years post-restoration. Now, they don't go into a huge amount of detail with this, and I don't want this to bog us down, but I just wanted to give an overview of how they went about assigning levels for a couple of these sub-attributes. So these levels, again, are based on qualitative or quantitative metrics, and those have to be decided by those familiar with the system. So they're customized to the sub-attribute and therefore for the site. So you have your attributes such as species composition, your sub-attributes, for example, non-native invasive plant cover, and then the different levels, and you can see the sort of thresholds they used to quantify those different levels. With, again, 1 being the worst and 5 being the best. So what's really, really cool about this tool, and why, like, the sort of crux of why I think this is really important and relevant to the MRG, is that this tool can assist in placing habitat restoration within the context of ecosystem level recovery. So the key connection here is really through the metrics used to assign levels. So since this tool is intended to be customized, for a wheel customized to the MRG, the metrics that are measured at the site level can apply both to the habitat and the ecosystem. So assessing metrics at a site can both address project-specific monitoring needs and can help assign levels to sub-attributes of the recovery wheel for the system at that site. So just going back here again really quick, I know you all are doing different things for your habitat restoration, but there's occasionally, well, maybe more than occasionally, some overlap. And so just for example, if you were trying to quantify non-native invasive plant cover as one of the important metrics for your species-specific habitat restoration, maybe you're restoring a site for the yellow-billed cuckoo or the southwestern willow flycatcher, those measurements can also be used on this wheel to assess restoration progress at the ecosystem level at that site. So those two things, habitat restoration and site-specific ecosystem restoration, they're not mutually exclusive, and some metrics may be common to both. But in order to make the recovery wheel useful to the collaborative program, it needs to be customized to the MRG. So the generic wheel isn't particularly useful. A customized wheel, which takes quite a lot of work, can be very, very useful. So how are we going to do this? Through a science and technical ad hoc group, which we're going to task with customization of the recovery wheel to the MRG. So ideally, this group will be made up of those with expert knowledge of the structure and function of the MRG ecosystem, as well as individuals with an understanding of current restoration and management practices in the MRG. So again, the wheel is highly relevant to what we're already doing in our program. So restoration and adaptive management are key to progressing towards recovery. Through these metrics, the species-specific habitat restoration that many of you are already doing can be directly related to progress towards ecosystem recovery. And then this tool also really provides a powerful way to visualize that progress. It can help guide ongoing monitoring and maintenance to prevent site regression. And it's just a great visual aid. So one thing that's really important here is that this isn't a standalone effort. So the SCR wheel for the MRG is actually part of a larger effort to address their quest for standardized monitoring guidance for the MRG for restoration efforts. And so the outcome of this group is going to be a recovery wheel customized to the MRG. But then the hope is to also form a second ad hoc group to create a compendium of restoration planning and monitoring resources for the MRG. So the results of these two groups, combined with ecosystem level driving questions, are going to be used to inform a third ad hoc group with the goal of actually creating this standardized restoration monitoring guidance for restoration practitioners in the MRG, which is quite a large effort, but I think this is the first step and will also be useful on its own. So thank you all so much. And I know this is a lot of information, so I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Zoe. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, Zoe. This is Chaitan.
Hey there.
Good to see you. I was just wondering, so for the other restorations sites that are utilizing the recovery wheel, how long did it take for them to like calibrate it to their area? Like how long did that process take?
That's a good question. And actually, I don't think for any of the case studies that I've looked at, they actually documented the process of customization. They mostly just talk about how they used it throughout the life of the project. I expect it'll take quite a while, but not, not an egregious amount of time. I think the key is really having the right expertise on this group to capture both the sort of ecosystem level expertise, but also the needs of habitat restoration practitioners, because we really want that crossover to occur and those both to be encompassed with this tool. And then I guess it's a great question, because it's also important to note that whatever is created can then be adapted, right? Like this process of adaptive management, you're not just creating a wheel and then that's the wheel that you're stuck with forever. It's something that can grow and change as people are testing it out and figuring out what's working and what's not working. But in terms of like a set timeline, I think it just really depends on the expertise. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, Zoe, thanks for your presentation. All great stuff. I was curious, the one of your last slides, the flow chart there that you had with the ad hoc groups and whatnot. I was curious for the resource part of it, the restoration planning resources and where that is at, time frame, and any kind of little deeper dive into the info associated with that group.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we're actually hoping to run these first two groups simultaneously and hopefully get them started pretty soon because we know that this is something that has been talked about a lot and is a priority for a lot of people. And so basically where those efforts are now is that we've done a lot of digging into what's available in terms of monitoring resources and in terms of restoration projects that have been done, because we think those two sides of the coin are both useful to have, you know, some vetted resources, but also to be able to see what other restoration practitioners are doing throughout the MRG. And so what really needs to happen at the ad hoc group level is just for people who are actually restoration practitioners to take all those resources, see what we're missing, and what else needs to be included, both in terms of habitat restoration resources and projects, and then figure out, you know, what's actually relevant and useful for practitioners and what's just going to be noise, because we really want this to be a tool that somebody can come to the program and say, I'm starting, you know, this restoration project. These are my targets, or these are my goals. Do you have something that can help me figure out how to set this up? And the goal is to be able to point them to a variety of reference projects, but also some vetted resources that can help them. So hopefully both these groups will get started within the next couple months. And I think we're going to be putting out a call, hopefully relatively soon, for members for both these ad hoc groups. And so it would be great to have this underway sooner rather than later.
Great, Zoe, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Are there any other questions?
One question I have, this is Chad McKenna, is are you planning on developing one single wheel for the Middle Rio Grande, or are you aiming towards maybe having wheels that might be more specific to species level restoration, project level restoration, site level restoration, etc.? And the reason I ask that is, you know, in our experience, we've oftentimes needed to build different types of success criteria based on, you know, specific goals for different locations, even within a site. So I was kind of curious to learn more about sort of the scaling of the wheel, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fantastic question. I think ultimately that'll be something that will be decided by the ad hoc group and the expertise we get there. My understanding based off of the literature, and I've talked to a couple folks who've had experience using the wheel, is that it does need to be site specific, but site is very general. And so I think for this initial wheel, the idea is to customize it to the river floodplain ecosystem in general, but try to keep attributes that are relevant to sort of a variety of goals for restoration within the MRG, because what we've seen when looking at the restoration projects that are occurring is there's a lot of common targets and goals. So the idea for using this at the site level and the ecosystem level together would be to understand that if you're doing habitat restoration at a specific site, and you're trying to also show progress towards ecosystem recovery at that site, you're probably not going to be filling out all of the different sub-attributes for the wheel. Your project may only be relevant to certain sub-attributes. But I think that's going to be a question that the group has to wrestle with, because if we create one wheel and it turns out that it's too general and not useful enough, it may have to be further customized to, you know, smaller scales. But I think one of the sort of the impetus for creating this was to help address this need for a standardized monitoring in the MRG. And so I think in order to do that, you have to have some level of consistency across sites. And so I think the goal is to try to balance that, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions for Zoe? Thank you so much, Zoe, for sharing this with us. And as she mentioned, we are working through some more activities in the collaborative program, so stay tuned. Zoe, any last words?
No, I think that's it, but feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. And I think these slides will be up soon on the program portal.
All right. Thank you, everybody.